But we could start with just, I'm going to say, John Gershman, thank you for letting us have this wonderful space. I'm Margaret Scott. Both of us are part of the New York Southeast Asian Network, and that we're thrilled to be sponsoring this talk along with Laura Netterfield from the NYU Masters in International Relations program. Please, and Emily, our wonderful coordinator, please, for you online, if you're not a member or you don't yet subscribe to our newsletter, please do both. We have a lot of very interesting events, and one comes to mind on December 5th, Sydney Jones and David Tiberman, and we're waiting for Sydney right now. We'll be doing a conversation on the upcoming elections in MAIR in southern Philippines of the Bangsamoro autonomous region elections. And now we can start, and perfect. Then you just walked in, so we're good.
And we can pull it sound okay for folks online? Is there a way to check?
I posted on the chat.
Okay.
Fingers crossed. Okay.
I feel like I might have gotten a text from people, you know, if they couldn't hear. So.
Okay, so fingers crossed.
Yeah, monitor the chat. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Welcome, everyone. It's as Margaret was saying, it's a huge pleasure to welcome Matt Walton here. Matt is a professor of politics at University of Toronto. He is going to talk to us about the state of Buddhism and Buddhist nationalism after the coup in Myanmar. Previously to Toronto, he was a senior research fellow in Burmese studies at the University of Oxford. His first book was published by Cambridge University Press in 2016, and it's called Buddhism, Politics and Political Thought in Myanmar. And he's currently working on two books. One is a comparative study of Buddhist political thought, and the other one is a study of Mabatha, which we'll hear more about today. His research is really brilliant for his deep understanding of Burmese Buddhist concepts and politics and language, and also how he approaches it as with this comparative political theory angle. Among Burma studies people, he's also known for creating Tea Circle Myanmar, which is a really brilliant, highly regarded forum for young scholars who got their work, and especially Burmese scholars. And yeah, academics talk about decolonizing this and that, and creating space for Burmese voices, but Matt really goes out and does it. And the field of Burma studies is better for it. So we're delighted to welcome him here.
Can I just do a two-finger, Francis? We need to introduce you. The NYU community is delighted that Francis has joined the International Relations Department. She's a historian of Burma, and it's fantastic to welcome her, and she's the perfect person to moderate this talk.
Well, thanks everybody. Thanks so much to everybody who organized this talk and is hosting me today. I'll just say for anybody online, my voice will sound really bad, but it's not like painful or anything. So don't feel like, hopefully you're not like wincing there as you're listening to this. So I'm going to talk about this topic, the state of Buddhism and Buddhist nationalism after the coup in Myanmar. And in order to do so, I'm going to kind of set things up with some pre-coup discussions, you know, this era of Mabatha during the kind of quote unquote transition. And then we'll move into kind of post-coup dynamics. So I'm really happy to talk about any of them, right? Any aspect of those things. And so the kind of pre-coup Mabatha study is inching towards a book project co-authored with Dr. Makimama Ji and Athane. They were both researchers with me on a 2-year project studying sort of quote unquote Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar from 2017 to 2018. And that was sponsored by an Economic and Social Research Council of the UK grant. And it was, the research included almost 100 open-ended interviews with monks, nuns, supporters of Mabatha, detractors of Mabatha, government officials, NGO workers, community leaders, and activists. Took place all across Myanmar in Yangon, Irrawaddy, Mandalay, and Sagaing divisions, and then also in Rakhine, Karen, Mon, and Shan states. And we had qualitative interview database, but then also close textual study of Burmese media, including outputs of Mabatha itself. So that was journals, books, speeches, and sermons by Buddhist monks. So this research was in 2017, 2018, kind of as Mabata was on a downward trajectory. Well, it's 2024 now. We've had a little bit of a pause for me to settle into Toronto. Other team members to move on to other things, the COVID interruption, and tragically, one of our core team members, Saw Wei, passed away during that period. Coup, and now kind of trying to bring this together. And one of the things that we do think, and I'll be interested to hear what people have to say about this, there's a sense that the coup changed everything, right? Like wiping the slate clean. And I think that we feel like some of the findings, from our project are really still relevant for a kind of post-coup situation. The kind of circumstances that brought Mabata about, but the way that we're looking at analyzing them, I think, tries to highlight some of the contingencies, but some of the factors that played into their rise. Okay, so Emily, we can go to the next one. For almost 5 years, the most prominent group associated with expanded anti-Muslim and pro-Buddhist activism in Myanmar was Mabata, the Organization for the Protection of Race and Religion. It emerged during this period of significant political change and anxiety, and it essentially filled a religio-political vacuum in the country. It enjoyed widespread moral legitimacy due to its respected monastic leadership, its mission to protect Buddhism, and for a time also near immunity in the political realm due to its many patrons in the ruling government and military. And this group was virtually synonymous with quote-unquote Buddhist nationalism during its period of influence, but media reports, scholarly analysis even tended to really oversimplify its nature and thus miss its appeal to a wide range of constituencies in Myanmar. And so that work presented it mostly in binary terms, right? Like good or bad, pro-Buddhist or anti-Muslim. And I think Mabata was really all of those things and more. Its decentralized organizational structure allowed it to appear differently to different people. That offered political empowerment to some people, security amidst rapid social change to others, and then reassurance and legitimation to a wide range of people who were worried about the future of Buddhism in Myanmar and in the world. And so our argument is that that label Buddhist nationalism really obscures the nature of Mabata's wide appeal to a range of different groups, but it also obscures the relative fragility of the coalition that it seemed to lead and its claims to authority in that space. So in saying this, we're not trying to deny or undercut the very real and very destructive effects that Mabata had for many people in Myanmar. But we also think that telling its story is also documenting the ways in which it created conditions for supporting and empowering some communities, especially in this context of uncertainty and change. And when we look at its broad range of activities, we argue that it was engaged in an extensive but not uncontested renegotiation of what it meant to be Buddhist and political subjects. So we take that more nuanced view of the terms and limits of Mabata's influence and appeal. And what we see is that even after its demise as a formal organization, 2017, 2018, the circumstances of its emergence hold these important lessons for policy and politics in Myanmar. Since the 2021 military coup, of course, the political environment has become even more uncertain and unpredictable, but some of the factors that led to Mabata's creation and rise to prominence are likely to persist no matter the political landscape in the future. And we'll talk through some of those here. Next slide. I'm going to talk through the context relatively quickly here, but following other scholars, we intentionally resist using the term transition. Probably not going to find much pushback here. Transition paradigms, as many of you know, contain a sort of teleology that usually privileges a liberal democratic endpoint modeled on that which is idealized in Western nations, if never actually fulfilled.
Sorry, we're having some technical difficulties.
Okay.
So sorry.
I will pause for technical difficulties.
So
They're not.
That what? They can't hear?
I could turn on my microphone if that's not on. So sorry, we should have talked about this.
One time in my previous life, I did an entire presentation of this opera that I had written to this group. And only at the end, people said, like, we couldn't really understand the words of this video. Come on, like, you just sat here for like 2 hours watching this.
Okay.
So, yeah.
39 very patient.
Yeah, 39 very patient.
Recording in progress.
Maybe they're just used to kind of hearing me talk nonsense. And
I'm not sure if that's.
Oh, wait. Okay, sorry.
go find someone?
Let me get Patrick again.
Yeah.
You want me to push the table up further?
No, we're not sure exactly what the,
Sorry about
because
this.
according to that, the microphone's on.
Thanks for your patience, everybody. You may or may not be able to hear me say that.
Well, the voice being rough, we can't do much about that. And
Was
then
it
Fog says
recording though?
it's recording.
Can you hear? From the beginning
Is
of
it
the-
that there's no audio, or is it just hard to
I
hear?
think it might be just hard to hear.
Okay. So with both of them, yeah, I mean, I don't, Josh has been in a administrative position forever, so we've never seen it, but, yeah, and yeah, I see less in Southeast Asia things, and more just kind of departmental, like, you know, like over and logic interests, Burmese also, and so we, Burmese Chinese, so, you know, like, kind of departmental functions. Yeah. Oh, okay, so I got two texts with people who say they can hear me just fine.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Perfect. So
Kevin Fogg says, you should keep going.
I'm just
Okay.
gonna address
Thanks,
that.
Kevin. Yeah.
There we go.
People can hear him.
Oh, they can?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for the votes of confidence then. So we're talking about transitions and, you know, the problems with this, language. One destructive effect of transition narratives is to encode certain states, transitions that stalled, incomplete, or failed. And those transitional frames rarely acknowledge the wide diversity of political models, as well as the multitude of pathways to realizing them. And so it essentially replaces possibility with a kind of disciplining normativity. So, but even if we take away the kind of talk of transition and the frame of transition, it doesn't take away the uncertainties that characterize that period of rapid political, social, and economic change. And one area where those uncertainties manifested was in public anxieties was a deeply felt fear over the future of Buddhism. Of course, concern regarding the perpetuation of Buddhism is a recurring motivator in Theravada Buddhism. Historically, happy to talk about that later if people want to talk more about it, and a strong factor in encouraging people in moral practice or to the Sangha, the monkhood. So during this period, that sense of existential threat was strongly expressed in Myanmar over about 2 decades, and it sparked a revival in a number of different Buddhist activities. So this included a marked increase in public sermons given by monks and a proliferation of organizations running Dhamma schools, basically non-formal schools teaching Buddhist classes. Mikhail Gravers suggests that in the face of debilitating uncertainties like this that are brought on by political changes and globalization, Myanmar's Buddhist cosmological imaginary provides essential stability. In one sense, I think that's correct, but it's that very dynamic that also amplifies the effectiveness of arguments linked to the need to protect the religion from in the face of elimination, right? If it's the only thing providing us stability, then we need to latch onto it even more. And since many potential threats to Buddhism coming from the effects of globalization are really abstract and kind of hard to respond to and latch onto, one narrative became particularly widely promulgated: Islam as an existential threat to Buddhism. So having come through that, and for some of you who know my previous work, it may feel odd that I'm essentially going to skip over the detail of that period of extensive anti-Muslim discrimination and violence, not because it's not important. It was undoubtedly pervasive and persists in many ways today. But it was also very well documented, perhaps to the detriment of understanding exactly what was going on with groups like Mabata, and what generated so much seemingly widespread support for the group, despite some of its rapid anti-Muslim spokespeople. So I'm going to pass over that subject in today's talk. Happy to come back to it to talk about more details. Go to the next slide, please. So really what we're doing in this project, in this book, is trying to disaggregate what seemed at the time like a coherent, unified whole of Mabata. The initial chapters in the book lay out a kind of empirical narrative of the emergence of Mabata, but also how it fit into existing institutions and practices. And you might be surprised to learn that our research revealed that Mabata's institutional structure was incredibly thin. But this ended up being of strategic value to the group, I think, because it allowed it, on the one hand, to take credit in the eyes of media or other groups for things that people liked, while also plausibly denying responsibility for the Mabata affiliated groups' rhetoric and violence, right? So if there was an individual, then they weren't like officially part of the group, right? Now, in this period, in this space, Mabata was not the only relevant actor, but as I said, it occupied very effectively this vacant religio-political space. Now, in contrast to Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, the religious and political spheres were relatively undifferentiated, at least at that time in like 2010. Ben Schoenfeld and I have written a little bit about this, comparing the two different places and whether we can call this a kind of similar sort of Buddhist nationalist movement. But that undifferentiation made this a prime moment of opportunity for religious and political actors to shape and reshape those norms of engagement. The other thing is that it meant that arenas of contestation in the political space would appear kind of unexpectedly and remain salient for various periods of time. So, as a few examples here, in 2013, you had the 969 movement. So this was before Mabata came out. 969 was really kind of decentralized, basically different groups of monks organizing either anti-Muslim boycotts or by Buddhist movements. Then from like 2013 to 2015, you had something that didn't really make it into the media very much, which was cow protection activities, right? Taken from similar kinds of activities in South Asia. This happened especially in the Delta. Then you had a more kind of formal period of the religious protection laws in 2014 and 2015. And after that, and after the NLD took power, a much stronger shift to first anti-Rohingya sentiment, but then going along with that, a kind of broader anti-West, anti-NGO sort of stance. So you had a lot of different manifestations of this in different periods. What that meant was that sort of Buddhist nationalism or these groups looked very different at kind of, at different times, and were responding to changes in the context. So I want to talk about Mabata a little bit, kind of breaking this group down. The group's full name, as you can see on the slide here, Amyo Bada Thadana Sangshao Ye Apwe. So Sangshao Ye is like protection, Apwe is organization, why we call it the Organization for Protection of Race and Religion. But the interesting part is in the details of these first three terms, like what it's formed to protect. So Amyo, Bada, and Thadana, and this is where we get Mabata. This is the Burmese acronym for Amyo, Bada, Thadana. So I'm going to do the quick and dirty version of this here, but again, happy to unpack more of this if you're interested in. Roughly, Amyo refers to a kind of collective political or cultural identity. Alternatively gets translated as race or ethnicity or nation, somewhat similar to the word Lumyo. But it's also really just referring to a people, right, or a group. Bada is the term that has come to be applied to religion in general, right, to the kind of category of religion. Thadana is the Burmese iteration of the Pali word sasana, and this is used in the Burmese context almost completely to refer to the Buddhist religion. So we kind of say Thadana is Buddhist religion, but its scope is much more comprehensive. So, this includes the Buddhist teachings, texts and commentaries, material elements of the religion, temples, monasteries, the Sangha, the monkhood, the lay communities, and the lived experience of the teachings, right? So it's the existence of the Buddha's Dhamma, the teachings among Buddhists themselves. And so Thadana has always been a kind of motivator, because without Thadana, Buddhism would sort of cease to exist in any meaningful way. Anytime I get to spend with you is a good time. Can we go to the next slide? I feel like you need an introduction now. Okay, so here's where I want to make one of the kind of first interventions here. We found it useful in our work to distinguish between what we call capital Mabata, which is the organization Mabata, the Organization for the Protection of Amyo Bada, and a more general sentiment that it is a noble duty of monks and lay people to protect and propagate Amyo Bada Thadana. And that is what we label kind of lowercase Mabata, right? It's really important, I think, to acknowledge that this latter one, lowercase Mabata, represents a widespread, not necessarily divisive or inclusionary impulse among Buddhists, right? This is what people generally want and are interested And even during Mabatha's heyday, there were divergent views on the appropriate ways to protect Mabatha. That was one of the potential fault lines of the movement, and where it actually did get some criticism of like, do we protect this? And if so, how? Like, what is the way to protect Mabatha? But from its foundation, Mabatha kind of walked in and created a monopoly on lowercase Mabatha activities, right? Which essentially and functionally made it the only nationwide channel for supporting that work that is seen as essential for many Buddhists. So what are the implications for this kind of like analytical intervention here? Lowercase Mabatha persists. I think that it's still relatively widespread, at least in weaker forms. Maybe not in kind of rabid nationalist forms, but the idea that to a lot of people, Amyo, Bada, and Thadana are important and we should protect them, yes. One of the things I'm not going to talk about in detail here, but we do a lot of work on in the book, is the fact that one of the key sort of fault lines with uppercase Mabatha was that a lot of people's lowercase Mabatha differed from their version, but in ways that never sort of made it to the public discourse. So, not a single ethnic Rakhine person, ethnic Rakhine Buddhists are going to say, of course, we want to protect Amyo, Bada, Thadana. And then, of course, when we say Amyo, we mean Rakhine Numyo, right? Rakhine people's national identity here, right? And so those kind of like national or ethnic divisions were allowed to kind of like simmer underneath, and everybody sort of knew it, but that also meant that Mabatha still had this kind of claim on the whole thing. But so the intervention here is then also to say that Buddhist nationalism, this category, is not the same as Amyo Bada Thadana Sound Xiaoye, is not the same as protecting Amyo Bada Thadana. Iselin Friedenlund has been pushing for the term Buddhist protectionism, which I think is a lot better. But rather than use any of those terms, we tend to kind of sit with the Burmese there, because I think the Burmese includes a lot of aspects of this. So just as one example, the Burmese phrase Thadana Pyu is sort of like doing Buddhism, making Buddhism, which means doing all the work of Buddhism. And even just that kind of captures the active building up part, the protection part, all of these things, right? And so once we label this Buddhist nationalism, we really miss the range of activities that are kind of coming in. So in the book, we propose to see Mabatha as an assemblage, right? And so the way we understand assemblage is as both entity and process, right? It establishes relationships between things, new relationships, in part from components that have been established or linked before, but then some kind of new relationships or relationships that are established in new contexts that give them new meaning and resonance. And so, we can look at both discourse and activities as things that constitute and reconstitute communities. They deepen social obligations, they create new kinds of networks and obligations, they reveal the relevance of one sort of activity in a different field or context. I don't want to get too deeply into this assemblage discussion. Deleuzians argue till the cows come home about the proper usage of assemblage. There's a lot of gatekeeping, and I think people might take issue with our use of this. What we think is useful about this is that it helps us to emphasize the contingent coming together of this particular network, right? Capital Mabatha as this assemblage, right? That actually emerges out of a kind of pre-existing assemblage of a lot of different groups that are doing lowercase Mabatha here. But capital Mabatha then orients this towards distinctive issues. It uses particular methods, and it's in the specific context of rapid political, social, and economic change. For us, this notion of Mabatha as assemblage, helped us to navigate another issue that we really struggled with, which was how do we talk about Mabatha while also downplaying Mabatha, right? So there's political reasons for that at the time, especially. We didn't want to kind of give this more oxygen, but empirically, this seemed to be necessary for us. So everywhere we looked, we saw Mabatha as an organization as functionally and empirically weaker than it was perceived, right? It was kind of everywhere for a while. And in our view, it had claimed that mantle of religio-political space, but it had done so by effectively grafting itself onto previously existing institutions and authority figures. And so what they did was it made it seem like capital Mabatha equals Buddhist nationalism equals virtually all lowercase Mabata activities when this wasn't the case, right? That's what we felt needed to be disaggregated. Just as one other example, there was this, there was an article, and I think it was in Frontier magazine, a Burmese media piece, and it was writing about a group called the Dhamma School Foundation that was doing Dhamma school teaching, right, like Buddhist Sunday school kind of teaching. And in our research, we saw the Dhamma School Foundation really kind of trying to distance itself from Mabata's Buddhist Sunday school sorts of things, increasingly over time. But this article was entitled Mabata in the Classroom. And you could see all of the interviewees from this other organization, Dhamma School Foundation, trying to distance themselves from Mabata, but the author of the piece, the journalist, was not having it, right? It's still Mabata in the classroom, right? So there was no differentiation in this because Mabata seemed like it was everything and everyone. Okay, next one. So I'll kind of wrap up the sort of, pre-coup Mabata parts here. The book contains a number of different topical chapters that kind of perform this disaggregation, and I hope demonstrate the value of it. And I'm just going to briefly mention some of the topics here in case people are interested in asking about them. So one is Mabata's conflicts with formal monastic authorities, the State Sangha Mahanayaka Committee in particular. Another is changing norms around donation and social welfare practices, where Mabata was really kind of like leading some important changes in this space that brought them into tension with others. Tensions over Buddhist education, this informal Buddhist education. Fascinating dynamic of both oppression and empowerment of women, some very unexpected results from things that seemed particularly anti-women, but created a lot of space for women's empowerment. And then, as I said, this very contradictory sense of what the nation of Buddhist nationalism was in this case. And so overall, what we're doing is trying to situate this analysis within a broader argument that we should view Mabata's project as something that was much wider than simply an anti-Muslim campaign or a movement of Buddhist nationalism. The activities of the group touched on many aspects of people's daily lives, individual moral practice, education, donation and other religious practices, grassroots empowerment of Buddhists, political and economic activities. And through all those activities, Mabata's leaders were engaged in the creation of idealized Buddhist subjects. And as they're doing this, they're also, by implication, solidifying non-ideal subjects, right? This means non-Buddhist or non-ethnic Burman Buddhists. And it's solidifying and positioning those non-ideal subjects as partly or fully outside the religio-political community of concern. And that ultimate goal, admittedly, that's not how they talked about it, right? But this is what we saw. That goal ended up placing the group in a potentially contentious and oppositional position in relation to political and religious authorities, in some of these cases we track. But it also grounded its wide appeal to people concerned about the future of Buddhism in Myanmar, allowed uppercase Mabata to stand in for the anxieties of lowercase Mabata. But examining Mabata in this light help reveals the areas where its interventions aligned, at least momentarily, with those other groups, as well as situations in which their attempts to shape idealized Buddhist subjects were contested, not only by its opponents, right, the NLD or these other groups, but also by its erstwhile allies, like this Dhamma School Foundation, another group that was in the teaching space. So while Mabata as an organization was relatively short-lived, quite influential during that time, lowercase Mabata as a sentiment among Buddhists persists to these different degrees. And that's one of the things that we think makes it an important dynamic, regardless of the outcome of the current revolutionary struggle. And so that's what I'm going to turn to now to kind of unpack a few aspects of this. I'm just realizing we've talked about this for many years, and I feel like you've got to be happy to come up with some of these monks have received. One of the most striking developments to emerge after the February 2021 military coup in Myanmar has been the rapid fall in public prestige of several popular and influential Buddhist monks who supported the coup in the military. So monks such as the formerly incredibly influential and popular Sirigu Sayadaw have been the target of public vitriol, especially on social media and online. public vitriol that would have been almost unthinkable pre-coup. This erosion of a norm against public critique of monks has taken place alongside two other trends. So one is a general lack of visibility of monks in the front lines of resistance to the coup. People kind of contrast this with 2007 in particular, and 88 to some degree. And then a much broader public questioning and reassessment of a whole range of traditional hierarchies and arrangements in Myanmar society. So what does this confluence of dynamics suggest in terms of the influence and prestige of monks, the changing role of the Sangha more generally in Myanmar? So this is kind of preliminary work. I'm doing a lot of this research again with Athane, one of my collaborators here. But really what we're interested in is, what can we say about not just the way that individual monks are being treated here, but does this have some sort of broader institutional impact? And so we're gonna chat about that a little bit here. But in looking at this dynamic, we're also trying to kind of refine a concept that the late Michael Jerryson and I introduced in a 2016 article in Politics and Religion. And this was about the authorization of religio-political discourse. And briefly, our argument was that the authority displayed by certain Buddhist monks, like the controversial Wirathu, couldn't fully be explained with reference to orthodoxy, doctrinal adherence, or orthopraxy, kind of proper ritual performance. And instead, what we said was, quote, the symbolic power of a monk's pronouncement is amplified because of the cultural reverence attached to his vocation as a Buddhist monk. So our purpose in that piece was to kind of carve out the importance of that space more generally, and to recognize that there were dynamics beyond orthodoxy and orthopraxy that were valuable and important in legitimating things. But my subsequent conversations with Athane and others helped to develop a much clearer sense of the limit points of that institutionalized respect, right? I mean, we found it difficult almost 10 years ago to imagine the respect for Theravada Buddhist monks dropping so precipitously, right? That seemed like a persistent, maybe not permanent, but persistent kind of aspect here. So we need to pay more attention to when and how these norms of cultural authorization might change. In the paper, we wrote, quote, in effect, donning the saffron robes and becoming a monk elevates a man in Southeast Asian Buddhist societies and places him in the highest cultural role for Buddhism. Thus, when a monk makes a comment, the authority behind his words derives from his cultural status, end quote. And, maybe we can argue about whether it was accurate at the time, but it's definitely too sweeping a generalization for the current period. So to give some examples, in a very day-to-day way, if a layperson knows or realizes that a monk has taken only a temporary ordination, so a lot of Theravada Buddhist places are only temporary ordination, their conduct is likely to be much less deferential to them. So people notice that these are not sort of career monks. Also, as many people will know, even if a monk is speaking about a matter related to Buddhism or moral conduct, where they do have this cultural authority, they might experience disrespect or even pushback depending on what they're trying to convey. So for example, every time monks try to stop people from drinking alcohol, even though it's, in the precepts, they get a lot of pushback, right? So, there are clearly limits to this. And so what we want to assess the possible effects of this kind of unprecedented public critique. Some people might have read a ICG report from 2023 called a Silent Sangha that outlines some of the somewhat surprising absence of significant and visible monastic participation in the post-coup resistance. And that report was helpful in contextualizing some of the monastic response that offered some reasons for this, diminishing numbers in the Sangha, also a kind of COVID-induced depopulation of monasteries that left monks less kind of concentrated in these spaces, and also less so in safe spaces, right? In spaces that could foment kind of resistance and safe organizing. Those are some offered by the ICG report. My colleague Pyo Wei has talked about what we might call Sangha capture by military authorities over time. He has done fantastic work putting forward a really compelling argument that documents the military's ongoing Seya Daga project. So Seya is sort of word for monks, and Daga is like a donor, right? So this is like the monastic donor relationship. And in his description, this is an extended and documented effort by military leadership to cultivate relationships with monks over time through targeted donations. I want to be clear that that's not a kind of smoking gun. It's not the kind of full like hidden hand argument that directly links the military to, creating something like Mababa. But what it was clearly a very effective effort to build up a good impression of the military in the eyes of monks and at least limit kind of outright resistance, right? Like what happened in 2007. So it's clear that fully explaining the range of responses requires a disaggregation of the Sangha as an institution, and POA and Iselin Friedenlund have done a good start on this in their analysis of monastic responses to the coup. So really briefly, they split monks into these groups, those that are supportive of the military due to their adherence to what they call a Buddhist ideology of order. So that's a kind of belief that anarchy and disorder are inimical to not just kind of societal stability, but to good Buddhist practice, right? And that's an ideology that has at least tacitly supported decades of oppressive military rule in Myanmar and other Theravada states. That group also includes the kind of explicitly pro-military monks, and then what they call the obedient majority, the group that, while they don't explicitly support the military, continues to carry out their regular monastic duties, maintains the status quo. And the military has also been working to shore up its Buddhist bona fides in this period. It's been expanding construction of Buddhist edifices, including the biggest statue, been liberally bestowing titles on some of its monastic allies, and it's been trying in its propaganda to mark the resistance forces, especially the People's Defense Force, grassroots military groups, as anti-Buddhist. It doesn't seem like it's succeeded very much in this, but this is what it's been doing. And then Friedenlund and POA also describe the positions of revolutionary monks, people who put forward Buddhist-inflected justifications of revolutionary activity. None of those are more eloquent than the Saffron Revolution leader, King Zero, Minthonia, who's once again really deeply involved in this revolutionary moment. And for a lot of those monks, there is a Buddhist justification to this, where for them, revolution means fighting to restore Dhamma to Myanmar, the Buddhist teachings, not in the form necessarily of a righteous king, but in the form of a righteous and fair regime and a morally upright community. And one of the things I think is particularly useful about their work is that they nuance the observation that monks are not necessarily on the front lines of this by identifying many ways in which monks are supporting the revolution, albeit not always in the most public ways. Next slide. So there is also this sense of a more holistic revolutionary struggle, right? There are a lot of people, vocal leaders in the movement who want this current revolution to be more than just an anti-military political struggle. They're pushing for this to be an all-out revolution that would radically change not only politics, but the entire aspects of the entire society, including long-held sociocultural and religious values and norms, including existing hierarchies like the monastic hierarchy. And so this sort of iconoclastic nature of at least some discursive spaces in the revolution has also potentially put these traditional monastic moral hierarchies up for questioning to a much greater and much more public degree than is usually the case here. So one thing that we're trying to consider is what we can glean from social media criticism of monks. This is not yet a kind of sort of fully comprehensive data set or analysis. I'm going to talk in more anecdotal terms here, but just to get a sense of the directions in which we're trying to take this. So prominent Buddhist monks such as Sigdo Sayadaw or Shin Sekenda, who have been seen in public blessing the coup leader, General Min Aung Hlaing, other senior officials of them and other senior military officials, those kind of folks have come under really heavy public criticism, which is being expressed online in unusually irreverent manners. And so we wanted to kind of think through what this means. First is that this moral authority, the standing of individual monastic figures, is clearly neither uncontested nor inexhaustible. This also reflects the fact that the coup is deeply unpopular. Now that seems kind of silly to say in some ways, obviously that's true. But when we hold it up against the kind of moral authority that many of these monks had, it does suggest that no amount of moral or religious authority suffices to protect the public standing of a prominent Buddhist monk who's seen as supporting the regime. No public figure is going to make it unscathed if they're supporting the coup, make it out unscathed if they're supporting the coup. And one way that we kind of think about this is is a kind of notion of like tiers of critique that aren't based on whether the monk has supported the junta necessarily, but on a kind of public sense of betrayal relative to their previous status and positions, right? So it's what would we expect from the monks that we really love, right? Or the monks that we, think of as pro-democracy or something like that. So in this case, Sidikou Sayadaw's public reputation had declined among a certain population during the last decade. He was supporting Mabatha more, he was more frequently expressing anti-Muslim views, he was increasingly close to military authorities. But the public outcry against his support of Min Aung Hlaing and of the coup sat in contrast to a pretty strong, persistent reputation as a defender of pro-democracy protesters and extensive social welfare projects, right? So people who knew Sidikou kind of knew that he was a fair weather friend to pro-democracy folks, but he still had this impressive standing, right, among a lot of the population. And so he also doesn't shy away from making political statements, which kind of distinguishes from some of the other monks that the military regime patronizes. People are paying attention to his words in more ways. So I'm going to share a couple of sample comments here that we found in our online searches. Often, so some of these are from kind of like Facebook and other social media. Some of them are also from comment sections of Burmese language media as well. So there's the anonymity here. And again, these are not necessarily fully representative, but I think they give us a sense of the kind of sentiments that are out there. I'm also not sharing some of the like crudest ones. And I just want to kind of say that, like, not saying that to titillating here, I'm saying that to kind of suggest that there are crude ones, right? And that in and of itself is a really remarkable kind of shift here. So one article about Sidikou's support for the military, one of the comments, these are all in Burmese, and I'm just going to read the translations. It's not just the dignity of the country that's falling, it's the dignity of the Buddha that's falling because of your actions. And another one is even more kind of striking and direct. My reverend sons, as in the monkhood, will be the ones who cause the destruction of my Buddha's sasana, right? And these are the kinds of things that we heard maybe quietly during the Mabatha period, right? That it was monks who might be the biggest threat to Buddhism, actually. These kind of anti-Muslim monks who were not living by the Buddha's teachings. But now we see this even more. One particularly damning critique was rooted in Buddhist history and in the Buddhist suttas. One comment on an article about Sidikou says, quote, "I'd always heard about Devadatta and Ajasattu, but now I can really see it." And so if you don't know this story, this equates Sidikou with Devadatta, who was the notorious cousin of the Buddha, who was always trying to kill the Buddha, usurp his position, otherwise undermine his efforts, and who eventually ended up collaborating with political authorities to try to kill the Buddha, right? So it's another way of positioning Sidikou in a really like cutting, and kind of culturally appropriate metaphor here as someone who's betrayed the teachings of the Buddha in a specific way. Now, this isn't universal, right? So personalized pages of Sidikou Sayadaw and its various monasteries and projects are still filled with kind of reverential comments. But we see a lot more of this on, sort of pro-democracy media outlets such as Myanmar Now and the Irrawaddy. And so I want to contrast some of this that we see with the commentary on Sidikou's articles about Sidikou with relatively more muted criticism of leading monks of Mahana, the state Sangha Mahanayaka committee. Mahana is its Burmese acronym there. So this is the formal centralized body that exercises authority over monks in the country. And it's kind of interesting that they would come in for less criticism because Mahana has historically been one of the few consistent targets of criticism from ideologically diverse monks and lay people kind of across the spectrum there. Because they are under the authority of civilian authorities. And that's, there's a lot to unpack there that's tied up in the fraught relationship between monastic authority and political authority. That came into view a lot more during the Mabatha period, where Mabatha monks were more publicly vocal in their criticism of Mahana. But we didn't see as much kind of public criticism, or certainly not as vociferous, of Mahana. So the group was formally silent in the weeks following the coup. They issued a relatively restrained statement on March 18th, in 2021, kind of in the face of growing public complaint, people asking them to say something. There were also rumors circulating online that Min Aung Hlaing, the coup leader, and the Burma Sayadaw, the head of Mahana, had some sort of falling out. That was never confirmed, but despite the head of Mahana clearly having retained a relationship with the coup leader, it also seems like many people retained a level of respect for Burma Sayadaw. So when he passed away in 2023, there were almost no negative reports about him. There were almost no negative comments on reports about him. And in fact, it was, praise for his work for the Sangha. And so overall, he was not a regular target of public criticism, despite, being a very prominent monk who at least didn't speak out against the military coup, right, and retained those relationships. So the questions then are, what does this mean about the focus on individual monks in the context of broader rejection of traditional institutions and hierarchies? Does this get folded into a more generalized criticism of the Sangha? Monks have really traditionally expressed worries about this, right? That the conduct of monks, of some individual monks, is going to have a negative effect on the public perception of the monkhood and the standing of the monkhood. And from what we've seen, actually most of the commentary, the critical commentary, separates those criticized monks from the larger groups, right? Reflects that concern that this is not a criticism of the monkhood as a whole. One comment about Siddhagu was, please, Reverend Monk, turn back toward the face of the Buddha. Your actions are bringing shame to the monks who truly work to protect and preserve the sasana, right? So two things to note here. One is the separation of the individual from the institutional, but the other is that this notion of Tadana Tintain Sao Shaoyi, right? Like protection of the sasana still persists as people's concern, right? This is maybe a kind of pro-democratic or even pro-revolutionary context for this, but still there. So final slide here and final sort of comments. I think that one possible takeaway from this is to consider that people's actions on the ground and even their critique is not nearly as iconoclastic as some of the strongest public critique and public voices suggest, at least not in these sort of institutional ways, right? So it's not clear that the dominant voices on social media, some of the leading voices out in front of the revolution that are pushing for a more holistic revolution, are truly reflective of the population as a whole. And I say this like I'm here for broader revolution for that. So that's not a critique so much as an assessment of how deep that sentiment goes, right? No doubt that the vast majority of Myanmar's people are aligned against the military. They want them out of politics. Also, that anyone who prominently supported the military will probably be irrevocably tarnished, whether that's a layperson or a monk. But as much as I appreciate the promise of radical social change, I don't see evidence that people are ready to jettison monks or the institutions of Buddhism yet. And we expect that like in that last quote, that these various iterations of lowercase Mavatha will remain. I think that kind of the hope there is that there's more space for public discussion, right? That there is a discourse on, how this fits in with national politics, whether there are versions of a Myo Bhavatthana that can be more inclusive, or whether these are kind of intrinsically exclusionary. There's no more public scrutiny. But what it feels like we're seeing the beginnings of is people feeling less constrained by blanket practices of worshiping all monks, right? More inclined to start to treat some monks as individuals with their own baggage and drawbacks. Now, admittedly, there were some folks who were already doing this, but I don't think that this was the norm prior to the coup. There was a Irrawaddy article about a year ago that spoke to more extensive practices of what we might call due diligence on like understanding the full profile of a monk before supporting them, right? What are their ideological commitments? What have they done in the past? What do they think on the issues, essentially, right? And so, as a kind of preliminary conclusion, then it doesn't appear that there's this precipitous drop in the reputation or public esteem of the Sangha as a whole, as it's connected to individual monks. I think the Pyoe and Iselin Friedenlund article notes some voices within the revolution that were at least disappointed that there weren't more monks kind of speaking out, but that was, again, a relative kind of sentiment, right? We expect this monk to speak out and they didn't, rather than we're done with the monk. So what we expect to see then is in a future, hopefully post-military Myanmar, is a recalibration of existing norms or practices that Buddhists use in determining how they treat a given monk, in terms of how they're navigating the relationship between the robe more broadly, and then the specific views and actions of that individual monk. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully we've got some time for conversation and discussion. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Shall I go first?
Yeah, that's your moderator's privilege.
My privilege. Yeah, I was wondering about the difference, this critique of the monks and the like sudden downfall of the monks, and how some like the more, you're differentiating between the more radical critiques and the sort of saying that this is not reflective of the society as a whole. And I was wondering what the generational, if there's a like generational divide there, and it's like the younger people that are being more critiqued, and whether the like their formative experience, their formative years being this transition, what effect that has, or like who is being more radical and why in their critique.
Yeah, and so I mean, I think about this a lot, and I don't, this is a little bit kind of speculative. I don't have data on this, right? I mean, our initial sort of thoughts would be, yes, this is the, the generation that grew up in a more liberalized education environment, and now in this kind of radical, for some a kind of burn it all down sort of moment, where where iconoclasm is just a kind of part and parcel of that, right? This is and it's not just the military and Zidigu and other leaders. It includes Dasu and other kind of key figures. So that makes sense to some degree, and it makes sense that some of the most kind of prominent influential voices for that holistic revolutionary sentiment come from Gen Z actors. They also come from some of the remarkable kind of like left-leaning feminist labor activists that had been gaining the tiniest bit of ground and space in Myanmar before the coup. So that makes sense to me on the surface, right? But then the specific dynamics of the fighting in this revolution, and the intense fighting in the central Nya area in these rural spaces also suggests that there's that's where we might see kind of more radical responses as well, right? And I don't know that we've got great data on that, but those are the spaces where we see some of the most kind of radical pro-military responses from monks, right? So monks who are leading pro-military militias. There's videos of all these guys who are like carrying around their guns and doing the training and things like that. And so, it makes sense that the people who've experienced the kind of violent repression of these monk-led militias might actually, they might be the ones who we would expect to be more traditional in their values and their respect for the robe and the hierarchy, raised in the village to kind of believe this, right? I mean, that's what we might assume for that. But I think the circumstances of this particular revolution might suggest that there are even pockets of kind of radical change in views in the places where we might not expect it. Again, that's a sort of speculation and a thought, and we don't really have. I don't know that anybody's asking these kinds of questions. They're not what do you think about the monks in your area? Are not the first questions that we're asking of revolutionary groups right now.
And maybe that's why Sagaing is such a hotbed, because it's this, Pusoti next to here.
Right. Well, but that's kind of so. So what does that mean in a place like Sagaing, right? Because it is the the kind of heart of Buddhism, and you've got these radical Pusati monk-led reactionary forces, right? But you also have people who are sort of embedded in those social networks. And the other thing is maybe those are the people who, even if we see them as kind of part of the Buddhist heartland, are the ones who've seen behind the curtain the most, right? So again, this is not I don't have evidence of this, right? But just from what I know about about friends and colleagues who have been very embedded in these monastic led spaces, like, they know the skeletons, they know where the bodies are buried, and so they have all the more reason to be, disillusioned with something like this. Ben?
I was curious how ethnic alignments have changed and whether there still is an overwhelmingly ethnic Burma dominance of the Sangha, or whether some of the revolutionary monks are from other ethnic groups.
So it's hard for me to point to particular examples of revolutionary monks who are from who kind of identify publicly, right, as of non-Burma ethnic groups. I think a number of the inequities the ethnic inequities that we saw across Burmese society as a whole were reflected in the monkhood, right? And so, the opportunities that like rural Pao monks would have would be facilitated only if you get this like prominent Shan monk who then has connections to a lineage, right? A kind of centralized lineage. So I think, non-Burma monks are really aware of some of those inequities. And at the same time, some of the prominent non-Burma monastic spaces have sat in really complicated relationship to both the post-coup military and the revolutionary forces. So we think about the ways in which one thing we talk about in the book is how, perhaps surprisingly, even though we talk about Rakhine attitudes towards Emil Bada Thathana being very Rakhine-centric and Rakhine's kind of standing, keeping Mabatha at arm's length, that was not the case in Karen state, right? There was a lot of overlap between Karen formal state leadership of Mahana, the formal authorities, and Mabatha leadership. And actually it was the Karen Mabatha monks who, when Mahana issued their statement to say, you can't use this name anymore, basically posted a photo that was like, here's my signboard, come and claw it out of my cold dead hands kind of thing, right? So that was perhaps surprising, right? That a group that clearly had no love for, Burma in a kind of ethnic nationalist sense, saw the utility of this movement, right, for its own particular reasons. So then thinking about these dynamics in the revolution, although I can't, kind of name some particular monks that are leading that, I do think that some of the monks who maybe had leadership in the Saffron Revolution and are kind of leading revolutionary kind of articulations of this there's some evidence that they're thinking more carefully, like a lot of Burma activists are, about what it means to live in a kind of pluralist Myanmar. I think that certainly a monk like King Zero in some of his interviews and public statements is talking about that in a kind of small d democratic, decentralized way that recognizes the need for, kind of prominent federal democracy. The question is still, how far do their anti-hierarchy tendencies go, right? I mean, how does attacking the kind of Burma central hierarchy endanger a kind of respect for monastics from that? And I think that's a worry that a lot of monks still have, right? I mean, I think they see the iconoclastic waves and don't want to get caught up in that in negative ways, right? I mean, that's not a I still need to get ferried around in a SUV kind of sentiment. That's I really think that Buddhism is good for people's lives, and I don't want us to throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. And so I think there's a lot more careful thought about that, but I have no idea whether, kind of ethnic or socioeconomic distinctions within the monkhood itself are part of their conversations. That's a really good question, something that's worth exploring. Thanks for sitting. Oh, do we have the same thing here?
We have the same thing. Have you done, or some of your research people done things on the diaspora? Because, the diaspora is funding both the CDMs but still very big on the monks who are in the different pony towns around America.
Yeah.
And Citigu has a ton of taxes.
Right.
That if you get any small info on that, just send it, because he's on the big sanctions list, right?
Right,
He
right.
should not, how we get at that, I don't know.
We
So
should
that's-
introduce Maureen at this stage as being one
I
of
don't
the
know,
leaders of
more
the
he wants to be,
diaspora.
but yeah, no, so this is great and really important, and I think, so we have not been tracking, kind of funding in that way, right, through those networks. I'm glad you are, and I think we'll pay more attention to
Oh,
that.
I'm just going after Citigu in my
Yeah,
own
right,
small
that's-
way.
that's-
But still, because how do you
Right.
find out more?
Yeah,
Is through the diaspora gossip, is how you find out who's up, who's down.
right,
Minna lines, they're all feeding off yours, mine taxpaying taxes.
Right.
By getting courses and free tuition waivers and getting.
Yeah.
All because the ineptitude of the Homeland Security, so you can get worse, but don't get me started on that.
no, so this I think is really important, and I mean, I want to say a couple things about the diaspora for this. So folks who have studied Southeast Asia for longer, South or Southeast Asia will, will know that this is a dynamic that's happened in a number of revolutionary situations, right? So Ian Baird wrote a lot about Laotian monks in the Pacific Northwest, and their either their material support for revolutionary groups or their moral struggles over, material support for revolutionary groups. That was in the 90s and 70s, and then again in the 90s, I think. And so I have just personally, speaking from experience, seen monks navigate this in a lot of different ways, right? I mean, I think that, and I'm not going to name cities here just because I feel like monks, this is a very personal choice for monks, and I think it often reflects not only their personal convictions, but also what they feel their community is comfortable with, right? I mean, and that's not a deferential sort of thing so much as I still need to be the kind of shepherd of this diaspora community, and so I need to not act in ways that are gonna push them away from me, right? And so I think monks are navigating that space, and we certainly see monks who are very visible on social media and also in person in diaspora, anti-military, pro-NUG kind of protests. And certainly, monks who at the very least give their imprimatur to the fundraising that happens, right? Because for anybody who doesn't know, as Maureen was suggesting, this revolution has been entirely crowdfunded on the backs of the Burmese diaspora around the world. And so I think the monks who are here know that they are facilitating some of that, right? That they play a role in doing some of that. And I think some of them have those moral quandaries, and others kind of feel a little bit more like we just need to support the people in this moment, right? But so the question of flows of capital and of money is really interesting here. I mean, my sense is that on revolutionary sides, that's not going through monastic networks as much. But on the kind of pro-military side, I guess I wouldn't be surprised if it was. I mean, Thitagu, as you say, was a cash cow, right? And continued to be, and still has his, has his supporters, definitely. The other thing that I want to say about diaspora politics here, and I'm just going to make a plug for our Toronto, Canada community. That was a really active community in terms of Burmese diaspora and kind of community engagement politics about a decade or two ago, and it really split on during the Rohingya genocide. And we've seen in the community since the coup a number of changes in sort of attitude, at least in rhetoric, right? And then changes in attitude as well. And I think it's marked by by different generations, right? And undoubtedly some of it is kind of strategic and instrumental, right? Burma leaders know that they can't do this, right? NUG leaders know that they can't continue to be exclusionary. But what we also see, I think, a little bit more than, right, a deeper kind of engagement. And we had in Toronto a few weeks ago, I hope that we're going to have a post on T-Circle about this soon. We hosted a display, an installation, and then a couple events around a work called Ek Kale, which is by the photojournalist Greg Constantine. So some of you might know Greg's work. He has an exhibit in the National Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC. And he has documented the Rohingya kind of as the sort of as the paradigmatic stateless people for decades, and finally decided that, like, what was this doing, right? What was this doing to help? And so Ek Kale is this project that he's worked on for 4 years with Rohingya communities around the world. It's material evidence of their belonging in Burma over time, right? So it's family photos, you know, work documents, land documents, you know, university photos, graduation photos, like a photo of a mixed Rakhine Rohingya football team from like Sitwe University, right? All these kind of amazing things. And, you know, and he's been taking it around the world. And in addition to a kind of general public exhibit for this, we worked really hard with leaders in the diaspora to build a kind of diaspora engagement event around this, right? I always sort of tell this story. Sorry, I'm just really keen to talk about this. I think it's like one of the most important things that I've been involved in. So when you look at Greg's things, he's got a letter from this Rohingya guy who had fought with the British, right? And the Rohingya were in some of the riskiest kind of positions during the World War II. And he says, you know, there's all these kind of riots, and I'm really worried about violence, but like that can't be the path we take. The Constitution has to be the master, and like rule of law is the way we're going to do this. So that's a noble sentiment in that context. But then he says, I'm also really worried about the Burmans. Like I think they don't want us here, and I feel like, you know, it's going to get really bad. And the first time I read that letter, I was like, you could take off that, you know, that Rohingya name and slap on a Karen name and slap on, you know, lots of other ethnic names. These are, every single person in the British Army was like writing about this fear, right? And this was an opportunity to kind of show some of their shared histories. And so we had this amazing event where a couple dozen folks came up from the Rohingya community in Kitchener, and a couple dozen non-Rohingya folks to share these kind of stories, right? And what was perhaps more interesting and more compelling than you know the content, which was great, was just the sort of casual mingling that happened afterwards. Like, you know, those of you who've worked on Burma for a while know that like this does not happen, that you get Rohingya and non-Rohingya people in the same room, kind of first off talking about how they're all part of Myanmar, and then second of all just talking about their kids and, you know, things like that. And so that really is like that can happen in the diaspora spaces. It's not happening automatically. It's not happening without a whole lot of effort, right? Because these are communities that have been divided for a long, long time. But we're seeing some of those kind of spaces open up, and they have to open up in the diaspora right now, because, you know, they can't happen in Rakhine State, obviously, at the moment. And we're seeing some of those spaces in, you know, Chiang Mai among diaspora there. Like those things are starting to happen.
The women's groups are much better at fostering that.
I mean, so the women's groups have always been much better at fostering that, right? They've been.
That's it, women have.
Right, I mean, I won't argue with that. And also it's a generational thing, right? Like, you know, the folks who are my students don't even bat an eye, right? It's not like, you know, we're coming to this as like, this person's a Rohingya. It's we're coming to this as like, we're interested in Myanmar things. So, you know, we're seeing those kind of changes, and I, you know, I find those exciting.
Can I just do a follow-up,
Sure.
which is, it's really like where up to has kind of disappeared. I mean, not really, but you know what I mean? Is he just biding his time? Would you consider be nice enough to call him a fair weather friend also? He's waiting, or is he spent, or what?
Some, you know, when he was released, right after the coup, I mean, and subsequently after the coup, they gave him some title and some award, I think, as well, but they didn't really kind of trot him out very much. And so what I've kind of heard was that not that he was a fair weather friend, it's just that like he's kind of unwell, right? And was not, you know, kind of
mentally,
yes,
yeah,
like right,
yeah.
and whether that's
Yeah.
time in prison or pre-existing things or whatever, you know, we knew that happened with other saffron monks and things like that. So you know, I think had had the military government been able to trot him out, I mean, I think he still had a real following among the folks who were still there and in kind of the, Mabata didn't exist, but the people who were still pushing that line, he would have still been a figurehead for that. I think they would have brought him out if he was going to be effective. And so that's
No,
that's
not-
rumor, right? But that's
No, I'm sure it is.
yeah.
Yeah.
We have a lot of questions in the chat.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. I'll see what I can
So,
Some of these
Yeah.
are comments
I'm
though,
reaching the end, but we
Yeah.
can carry on. Is that all right with you?
I mean, I'm fine. Yeah. Oh, yeah, we got a lot of, okay. Sorry.
I'm sorry, I should have brought it up earlier.
All right, no, Nikki's really active here.
Nick Cheeseman?
No, Nikki Diamond. Hi, Nikki. I'm trying to see what I can kind of like bring together here. So yeah, okay, so we've got questions from Nikki Diamond. I'm gonna kind of like read these out a little bit. Theravada Buddhists, Burmese Buddhists have no religious, cultural identity and resources. The Myopada Thadana is predicated upon shared myths, historical narratives, et cetera, historical experiences and processes, British colonization, Burmanization. Sorry, Nikki, I'm not trying to dismiss this. I'm just trying to time with this. So it structures, right? It arranges kind of practices and perceptions. I mean, I think that's true, right? But like, so Benedict Braque de la Perriere talks about the kind of enabling of a Myopada Thadana, that like the enabling positions that allow it to come together as a thing with all three connected, right? And I think that's true to some degree. I mean, these are identities that we might understand to have been already connected for some people in pre-colonial spaces, right? And so Myopada Thadana is then a reiteration of something that gets pulled apart once religion becomes a category, once nation state identity becomes a political category as well. And so you see, there are articulations that harken back to the Dobama movement in the 1930s, kind of like our land, our language, or things like that. And so, but I think Nikki's right, if I kind of get this, that like these need to be put together, right? Like there's a moment of articulation that has to happen to kind of bring them together kind of plausibly and coherently for people. And that's where I think Mabata, the organization, got to kind of ride the crest of like Myopada Thadana being an unquestionably kind of good and connected thing for many people. Whereas I think there's been more kind of pulling apart of these things, right? What do they mean? And do they need to be connected? And is this a kind of like good thing for us or not, right? So I think this specific formulation of Myopada Thadana is relatively recent, but it kind of harkens back to some other ones in the past. Paul Sarno is asking about the extent of monks' support for Pew Saw Thi. So these are like the reactionary pro-military militias that are there. And Paul asks, is it mostly rural? What regions? I'm probably not the person who's expert on this. I mean, like from what I know of this, it is mostly rural and it's in the kind of Burma sort of heartland areas. But I don't think that it's that extensive, right? I mean, we really hear about and see at least 2 monks who have had leadership positions in these groups. And so, that's shocking because, just like it shocked everybody when monks were killing, Muslims in 2010, it's shocking to see monks, like taking their guns and leading troops and things like that. But I don't think it's all that extensive. Right? There really aren't that many examples, especially not kind of leadership examples. And so Eric White is asking, to what degree do pro-revolutionary monks draw on classical discourses that identify unrighteous kings, political rulers as threats to the survival of the sasana? So I think that the best work on this is done. We haven't done anything on it yet, but the article that I mentioned by Pyo Wei and Iselin Friedman talks a little bit about this, and they're not actually doing so much of that, like the kind of bad king, unrighteous king. It's more about sort of restoring a kind of like more equitable Dhamma kind of across there, right? So it's actually, it feels like for a lot of those monks, there's more of a direct disconnect from, even in a critical sense, from these histories of, you know, righteous, unrighteous king, right? Kind of taking away that monastic kind of language for that. Okay, I'm never gonna make it through all these, so let me just see if there's maybe one or two that great. So one person asked more about the due diligence kind of component, people making distinctions between pro-military monks and others. What kind of pressures are lay people kind of exerting there, right? So I think that is, again, this is kind of anecdotal, but this is about, you know, withholding donations, but that's maybe not in a kind of like direct way. It's also, we're talking about kind of like choosing from the beginning where to kind of put their money or who to support, things like that. So I think that's where we'll see a kind of more kind of critical practice. This question is really interesting because it says, can these practices of discernment and pressure be described as in any way democratic? You know, so to the degree in which they're empowering individuals in terms of how they are spending their money, and participating in their community, I mean, I think there is a kind of individualistic, right? There's maybe a sort of neoliberal kind of like democratic aspect to it. But I also think that to the degree that it is not an unquestioning kind of support for an existing hierarchy, maybe that's maybe less about democracy in that kind of sense. And the final one I'll take here is, have there been any reactions, pressure, influence from the larger Buddhist world outside of Myanmar? I haven't seen much here, and frankly, it wouldn't matter if there was. I think this was, you know, this was a character, I didn't talk about it here, but characterized the whole Mabatha period where, you know, prominent Thai monks would come in and they would, you know, give some talks, and Sulak came in, and they just got ignored, right? I mean, it was kind of like, this is our Buddhism, like, we got this, don't, you know, and so, you know, all the articles and all the kind of, you know, foaming at the mouth from like Western Buddhists that like, this is not Buddhism and things like that, that didn't have any sort of effect. So the only thing might be what Maureen brought up is if like, you know, if the Burmese diaspora Buddhist institutions and networks kind of feel the crunch in certain ways, maybe that would have a kind of effect, right? But that's, you know, and I say that partly because the support of like Thitigo and others is coming largely from Western Buddhists and Western institutions and things like that. So we might see something like that, you know, I mean, we could see that having an effect, a kind of material effect. But I think, you know, Buddhists from around the world, I mean, it's fine. It's not like, you know, there's no obligation for Burmese Buddhists to like care what they have to say. So thank you very much. If I can try to follow up on some of these more individually, I will do so. But thanks so much for the really, really compelling questions.